Chris Whitty chaired a ethical advisory group in March, because they could see this coming, and March 2020. And they discussed the factors that they would use to decide who would get care and who wouldn't. And we spoke to people on that committee, and they said it was Nazi-like.
Welcome to Storytellers, where long-standing journalists at the Times and the Sunday Times give us 3 definitive stories of their career. And today I'm delighted to welcome along the Deputy Editor for the Insight Investigations team for the Sunday Times, George Arbuthnott. George, thanks for joining us. 3 stories. Let's start with the one that made you. And this came about not long after you joined the Insight team.
That's right.
Tell us about it.
So before I joined the Insight team, I'd been interested in doping in sport. And I'd had a contact who was close to the British athletics team, who'd raised concerns that some of Britain's top athletes were basically pretending to be ill in order to get a justification for taking performance-enhancing drugs. And so I rang around all the athletes who'd been around the camp and all their support staff. And what became increasingly clear was there was particular concerns around Mo Farah's coach in America, a guy called Alberto Salazar. And a lot more investigating pursued, and calling people over America as well. And eventually we ran a story which ultimately led to Mo Farah's coach being banned years later. But off the back of that, developed more contacts, and particularly worked with a German journalist called Hayo Seppelt, who was famed for his work on doping in sport. And we agreed to work together, and we got leaked this extraordinary database of all the blood tests of all the world's top athletes over a decade. And
which was a treasure trove.
It
revealed around more than 800 athletes, and you've got their blood data. So this comes after athletes compete. They are subject to regular tests, and the data is collected in a nice, neat bundle. And along with the German broadcaster ARD, you started to work your way through this, what was until then secret data.
So it had always been locked away in the vault of the World Athletics governing body, but suddenly we had it at our fingertips. Obviously, as journalists, we didn't understand what the data meant initially, and so we had to find sort of world-leading experts to allow us to read what the blood values meant, and that was actually quite difficult because a lot of the experts were contracted with the governing body, and we didn't want them to know that we had it because they might try and take it off us.
And you wanted an independent view as well.
Exactly. But luckily we found 2 experts who really felt strongly that the authorities weren't doing enough to tackle doping, and they were intrigued of what the values showed. And when they went through it, they were astonished.
What did they find in brief?
So they found that the blood doping helps endurance athletes. The more red blood cells you have in your body, the more oxygen, the more energy you can create, and so the longer you can run for faster. And you can have huge performance gains, like 30 seconds in a 5,000 meter race or a minute in a 10,000 meter race. So you can go from being last to first. And what they particularly looked at was all the endurance medalists in the World Championships and Olympics. And they found that a third of them had highly suspicious blood test results, suggesting either use of EPO, the blood boosting drug, or blood transfusions, where you take blood out of your body a month before a race, then let the body create more blood, and then just before the race, you put the blood back into your body, which gives you more blood than you normally have, which allows you to then run further and longer because you have more red blood cells than you naturally would do.
And viewers might be familiar with this because there was a big scandal involving Lance Armstrong and many many elite cyclists who were also taking EPO, it turned out, and also going down the blood transfusion route as well. Your experts found that 146 medals were won by athletes who were likely to have doped or suspicious, requiring more investigation. 55 of those medals were gold medals. So, serious implications here from the athletes involved. You would have put the results, I mean, tell me how it works. Presumably you would have put these results to the International Association of Athletics Federations, the IAAF.
Exactly.
Who I presume then were not very happy with you and probably tried to block the work. How much resistance was there against this? Because you were, it was about to be a huge expose.
That's right. So we went to them a few days before the story, and they were furious and arguing that it was private medical data, etc. But
could they explain it? Did they attempt to justify the data?
Well, what was clear was that they'd, despite the fact that they had this data, and some of the athletes, their blood values, it was a 1 in a million chance that they could have blood values naturally, like that naturally. And so there was no question that they were doping. I mean, there was one race in the Olympics where 4 Russian athletes who came the top 4 places all had a 1 in a million chance that their blood values could be that naturally. But none of those medals have been taken away by the IAAF. They were arguing that it was a kind of grey area, and you couldn't be sure that the blood values showed doping. But this was completely contradictory, because the reason they'd been taking the blood test results was to prove doping, and so it was kind of inherently contradictory what they were arguing. It became a huge scandal. I mean, a month after we broke the story, the head of the IAAF was arrested for taking bribes from athletes to cover up positive doping tests. And so what became clear was that they weren't just ignoring the doping in sport. They were actually corrupt themselves and were part of the problem.
What happened as a result? Were any athletes then later banned? What was the result of this big expose? You said that medals were not taken away in some cases. We know that Russia was one of the countries involved. In fact, I think 80% of the medals won by Russia through the course of the period that you're investigating had a suspicious blood test related to them at some point. What was the outcome? Has there been an outcome or not?
Yeah, so the outcome was quite seismic. We had never expected the result to be as strong as it was. So the Russian results were exceptional. They weren't the only ones doping. I mean, the Kenyans, long distance runners, their blood values were extraordinary. And obviously, as we've discussed, there were some British athletes as well. But the Russians were out on their own. And so before the story, we had reporters running around Russia trying to get hold of these athletes so we could put the allegations to them and give them a right to reply. But a few months after the story, it was announced that Russia was going to be banned from the 2016 Rio Games. And so that was a huge result. And obviously, there have been further investigations by the World Anti-Doping Agency.
Yeah. There was a parliamentary inquiry here, wasn't there?
Absolutely, which found that it was completely endemic across the whole, across Russia.
Let's talk about the story that nearly broke you. And look, when you're an investigative journalist, holding the government or a large organisation to account is hard, sometimes quite dangerous, risky. What about the SAS then, if we're talking about about risky organisations, an elite fighting unit, part of the British Army, taking them on? This is the story that nearly broke you. Tell me about it.
So in 2016, we were told by a source close to government that there were serious concerns about the conduct of the SAS in Afghanistan, and in particular that they had been executing civilians during their tours there. Particularly so the SAS would try and target Taliban fighters by identifying them, working out where they lived, and then flying in at night on helicopters and surprising them effectively. Now, the allegations were that the SAS intelligence was actually pretty poor, and they were arriving at compounds. The people were actually just civilians, and they would raid the compound. They would capture the people in it. They would then separate the men from the children and women. They would handcuff the men, take the children and women away, and then execute the men, which is obviously incredibly serious allegations. You know, the whole point of us being in Afghanistan was because terrorists had killed innocent civilians in America. And the allegation was that we've been doing exactly the same thing in Afghanistan.
And the point was not to execute them either, was it? The point was to detain them, capture them.
Yeah, well, under the Geneva Convention, if you capture someone and they're not armed and they pose no threat, then you have to detain them. So these were extremely serious allegations. This was a very controversial story because the SAS were kind of the heroes of Britain, and the Sunday Times has been very supportive of the armed forces over the years for obvious reasons, and so reporting allegations like that, extraordinary allegations like that, required the kind of extraordinary evidence, and trying to find witnesses on the ground in Afghanistan where there was a war still going on, trying to get the SAS to talk to us about it.
I mean, dealing with the military is a very closed book. They have their own investigations. Trying to elicit any kind of information or accountability is extremely tough.
Right. But we decided that this was such an important story that we had to take it on, and so we contacted hundreds of members of the armed forces, members of the Royal Military Police who might have investigated this. We did reporting in Afghanistan, trying to speak to the families of the victims, forensically going through photographs of the scenes of the killings, speaking to legal representatives of the families and also of the army. And each time we felt we got to enough evidence that was a threshold to publish. But obviously our editors and our lawyers were saying, no, you need more. And so it took us more than a year.
So how long had you been, so you'd been working on it for a year. The deaths took place between 2009 and 2012. Your piece was published your initial reporting I think was 2017. And during this time, we should say that Operation Northmoor had begun, and at that point was still going, and that was an internal investigation, effectively by the Royal Military Police into these allegations, which had been running with huge resource and at great cost.
That's right, and what we knew was that that the government seemed to want to wind the whole thing up, and we could see that we were kind of expecting Northmoor to go on and start bringing action against the soldiers, but then we could suddenly see the cases were all being wound up, and suddenly the government announced that they were closing the whole thing down. And so we realised that we were the only ones
still investigating, effectively.
Still investigating, and eventually we did manage to get soldiers to speak to us, people who'd seen what had happened and been extremely unhappy about it, and they described how SAS soldiers had bought what they called drop pistols on missions, where once they killed an unarmed individual, they would then place the weapon in the hand of the dead body and then take a picture and say that was evidence that they had
were armed
posed
and
a threat.
dangerous, effectively.
And also they claimed that their Afghan special forces partners who they were fighting with, they claimed they had done the killings, but later when the Royal Military Police looked at the case, they realised that the bullets in the bodies of the victims were British bullets, not Afghan bullets.
So shells from army pistols, army-issued pistols.
And by claiming it was Afghans doing the killings, it stopped a lot of the investigations. So anyway, we published a story in 2017. Complete silence. None of the other papers wanted to touch it because it was, they didn't have the evidence that we gathered.
Were you nervous after you published? Or you got to the point where you were so desperate to get it published by then, after it being knocked back time and time again?
Yeah, we weren't nervous because we had our evidence. We were confident in it. We'd had to jump through every hoop to get the story published in the first place. But it was predictable that there wasn't a huge response because it was, a lot of the comments from our readers were saying, these are our brave boys. They're in a difficult situation. You can't expect them to be perfect. But we then did a second story in 2019 where we worked with BBC Panorama and produced further evidence. And meanwhile, the victims that we'd found in Afghanistan has begun to bring civil cases against the British Army for compensation because their loved ones had died. And this started to force disclosure from within the army that we've been unable to get, and through the courts. And what they revealed in 2020 was all these emails from within the SAS and the Special Forces Directorates, where they were effectively admitting that dozens of killings appeared to be executions. This eventually led to, last year, the government was finally forced to set up an inquiry, public inquiry, which is currently ongoing, and which is finally kind of holding the army to account for it, and hopefully we'll get to the truth, the full truth of the matter.
Yeah, and also finally start to see some prosecutions, because Operation Northmoor was closed with no prosecutions, despite looking at several cases. There was only sort of one outstanding at that point because of a civil claim. Look, I'd imagine that you do receive threats as an investigative journalist, how harsh they are. I mean, I wonder if you could sort of cover that at all. Have there ever been points, and I mention this because this story involves an elite killing squad of men effectively, but not just with this story. Have you ever had to go to the police with the strength of threat that you've received? How much resistance do you get as a journalist when you're looking at a hugely inflammatory story, story that will, cause companies' share price to drop, cause, huge government departments to fall apart, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, the most serious threats I had was we did a year-long investigation into human trafficking in the UK. And we've been exposing a lot of British businesses that have been using human trafficking victims, particularly in the fishing fleets around our coast. And I did receive quite a lot of threats.
Who from?
Phoned in anonymous threats. But we're journalists. We haven't got kind of security or anything like that. So you just have to hope that they realise that if they were to, follow through on these threats, they'll make it so much worse for themselves, because obviously it would make it a much bigger story and make it much of a bigger problem for themselves. So, you just have to accept it as part of the job. And, you try and maybe obscure where you live as best you can.
Do you get told about every threat that you get?
I don't know. But the ones I have been told about, they're usually direct to you. I'm not aware that they kind of throw them into the paper separately. But most of them are legal threats. Pretty much every story we do as the Insight team is alleging major wrongdoing against someone powerful. And so they are desperate to do whatever they can to stop it. And so they're often rich, so they will hire the best lawyers in London, and they will issue unbelievably strong letters accusing us of all sorts of wrongdoing and maliciousness. And so for us, that's par for the course. And I'm sure we funded some of the top lawyers in London get probably thousands and thousands of pounds of
but in
fees.
the interest of of very, very good journalism, and it's also costly journalism, and that the Insight team is one of the reasons why the Sunday Times will justify being behind a paywall, because you simply can't fund long-term investigations like that without some extra help.
That's right, and then you have to fund a brilliant legal team that we work alongside, who
to make sure that you can get it over the line.
Exactly, yeah, and resist these legal threats that we get from the rich and powerful.
Does your wife or your family ever kind of question your choice of job and say, this feels too risky to me, George, or I'm not happy about you doing this for years and years and years to come?
Well, luckily I met my wife at the Sunday Times.
She's on board.
She used to be a journalist herself, and so she understands it. And some members of her family have been journalists. Because but if it wasn't for that, I think they would. There have been a few stories where things have got a bit hot. And
which ones?
It has got a bit
apart from
nerve-wracking.
the human trafficking, is there another one that springs to mind?
I think on the SAS one there were concerns around it because these guys there's a lot on the line for them, and some of the terrorism stories we've done where you've had to approach suspected jihadists and knock on their door.
What's that like?
That was nerve-wracking. They're suspected of about to commit some kind of terrorism, and you knock on their door as a Western British journalist, and your heart is slightly in your mouth.
Are they expecting you?
No, absolutely
not.
No.
Which is probably a good thing in terms of unless they clam up completely, but to have that element of surprise.
Last year we did a lot on computer hacking, so we were filming undercover computer hackers, and so that did concern me in terms of them trying to hack into all our home computers and everything like that. We cross all sorts of bad guys and face different threats.
Let's talk about the story that stays with you, and and I remember reading this one really, really clearly about coronavirus. 38 days when Britain sleepwalked into disaster. And I can still remember, it caused an absolute blowout amongst all the TV stations, because here you were charting the government under Boris Johnson's initial response to the COVID pandemic from sort of January through to March. And you published this, I think it must have been, a month into lockdown? So we were all, April 2020.
Yeah,
that's right. We were all pretty scared and pretty worried about what was going on at that time. Interestingly, our viewers will probably know a lot of the information already, because since your reporting, it's come out. But give us some key takeaways here.
Yeah, so in April 2020, by that point, there hadn't really been a huge amount of criticism of the government's response. This was kind of an unknown thing. We were all in unknown territory. We've been very trusting. But I think some people have wondered, we did seem a bit slower than other countries to take action. So we kind of forensically went through that period, and what became clear was that there'd been a completely lackadaisical approach, driven from the very top. We could see that there'd been 5 COBRA meetings through January, February
onwards,
and Boris Johnson hadn't chaired any of them.
And it took him until beginning of March, to attend his first one.
Actually attend one. And what we could also see, we were looking at some of the preparations for a pandemic. We could see that Brexit and the preparations for no-deal Brexit completely sidelined the planning for a pandemic, even though it was the number one risk on our threat register. But then when in February, Boris Johnson had decided to send hundreds of thousands of pieces of Britain's stockpile to China, even though we would need it in only a few months. And so it really, and we also spoke to the number 10 insiders who described how Boris had just shown no interest in this, dismissed it, said they wanted to focus on Brexit. And So yeah, the story caused a huge storm because by that point, we were all locked down. Thousands of people were dying every day in the hospitals. The PPE had completely run out, and so yeah, it was quite a thing, and the government was furious.
Yeah, because it was the first sort of mass presentation of evidence, of detail in terms of what had been going on for that January to March period. Really, was there a rush? Because I'd imagine that you'd want to be first. Was there a rush to get this story out? Because considering we'd only really been in lockdown a month, it was pretty impressive, work in terms of a quick turnaround. Was there a time pressure in that?
It took us 3 weeks. Our editor said she wanted to do it on this particular date, so we only had 3 weeks to do it. So we were ringing around all our contacts. But funnily enough, because we were all locked down, everyone was working from home, it was actually easier to speak to them because rather than them being in number 10, with being overseen by the head of press or whatever, we could, they were at home, so they could speak to us fairly at their leisure. And
were people willing to talk easily?
This particular source we had really felt strongly that they should speak out. It wasn't, we rang a lot of people who weren't willing to speak, but enough were to make the story and show what had really gone on. But the government were livid about it, about the story, and they issued a.
They denied it, didn't they?
Yeah. They said that this was nonsense, and they had been completely on it. They had been working furiously through February, trying to bring in PPE and all this, and the Prime Minister was completely on top of it all. And but actually, now the inquiry has now revealed that it was worse than we reported. Boris in February was arguing that he should go on live TV and be injected with the virus by Chris Whitty to show that it wasn't dangerous. And he'd gone on holiday to Chevening.
During that half term.
So, we were probably too kind to him ultimately.
So when we look at the COVID inquiry, which I know you've also been following closely, you and Jonathan Calvert, the editor of the Insight team, have written a book about everything from this initial period through to the origins of the virus, through to looking at the overall response. So you've been following this, super closely, as you'd expect. Has that inquiry thrown up everything that you would have expected it to by now? It's not finished, obviously, but I wonder, compared to your reporting and the evidence that you uncovered, but also things that perhaps you didn't publish because there wasn't enough grit behind them, has the inquiry revealed everything that you would have expected it to by now?
So there's a big glaring gap so far, I'd say, which is the thing that will stay with me, which is that the government always claimed that everybody got the care they needed who caught COVID. And we did a lot of investigations to this, and that is complete nonsense. In that first wave, only 1 in 9 of the people who died of COVID got into intensive care and got the ventilation that they needed. The rest of them either died on the normal wards in the hospital without that best possible treatment, or died in their own beds because the hospitals just couldn't take them in, or in the care homes. We spoke to doctors, ambulance workers, hospital directors, who all described how they just didn't have the beds for it. So they couldn't, if someone called from a care home and said someone's dying here, they need medical treatment, they would just leave them there. And it became a kind of a rationing of care. And they did it on a sort of triage system where if you were over the age of 80, they wouldn't take you in. If you had disabilities, you'd be scored down, you'd be less likely to get treatment. And this did come from the top. I mean, there was Chris Whitty chaired ethical advisory group in March, because they could see this coming, and March 2020. And they discussed the factors that they would use to decide who would get care and who wouldn't. And we spoke to people on that committee, and they said it was Nazi-like in the way that they were discriminating against people who were disabled or people who were old.
Yeah.
And there's been nothing about that in the inquiry so far. I'm hoping there will be.
Should there have been something about that by now? Or is that quite hard to say, sort of judging from where?
I think that definitely should have been, because they've had the Prime Minister up, they've had Matt Hancock up. The Prime Minister and Matt Hancock have both claimed at the time that everybody got the care they needed, which in our estimation was the biggest lie of the pandemic, which is going some. And so they should have been seriously cross-examined over that. I'm hoping that in the upcoming modules, there may be a renewed focus on what happened within the NHS.
Well, look, it's been so interesting to speak to you. Thank you so much for sharing 3 career-defining stories of your career, and I'm sure there'll be many more as well. George Arbuthnott, who's Deputy Editor of the Insight Investigation Team at Sunday Times. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.